The small town of Livingston lived its quiet, predictable life. The narrow streets lined with old houses smelled of fresh bread from the corner bakery and the rain that had fallen a few hours before. Here everyone knew each other by name, and news traveled faster than the wind. But that night it was different. The town didn't know that the tranquility was about to be shattered. The silence was broken by the squeal of an old car's brakes. The patrolman on duty, Officer Bradley, stood at the curb in his worn uniform. His face was impassive, almost stony, but his eyes betrayed a cold, almost sadistic interest. The driver appeared to be a young girl of about 17. Her skin glistened in the streetlight, and there was confusion in her eyes. "Good evening," he began, though there was nothing kind in his voice. "Do you know why I stopped you?" The girl, Kayla, swallowed, trying not to show fear. She knew of Bradley's reputation. There were too many stories about how he used his power going around town. "No, sir," she replied quietly, taking her driver's license out of her pocket. Bradley had been studying her papers for so long that it was beginning to feel strange. He was clearly waiting for something, a hint of weakness, fear. And he got it. Kayla rubbed her hands together nervously and looked away. "Wrong turn," he finally threw in. "Or maybe it was speeding. But I was driving carefully," she blurted out before she could stop herself. His smile was cold, almost predatory. "So, you want to argue with the law?" The night air seemed suddenly thicker, the silence louder. Bradley ordered her out of the car. Kayla's hands trembled, but she obeyed. She knew it was useless to resist. What happened next, the townspeople couldn't believe for a long time. Bradley, unable to find anything serious, decided to teach her a lesson, as he knew he could. He grabbed her arm and dragged her to a lamp post at the edge of the road. "If you don't want to respect the law, you'll be part of it," he threw, tying her to the pole with plastic handcuffs. His voice was cold, but a strange fire flashed in his eyes. Kayla was silent, her face wet with tears, but she didn't say a word. Passing cars slowed down, but no one stopped. People knew Bradley, knew that interference could get them into trouble. This night might have ended like so many other injustices in Livingston if it weren't for one but. Kayla had a father, and his anger was a power Bradley couldn't even imagine. Bradley took a step back, admiring his work of art. Kayla, tied to a cold metal pole, was illuminated by the dim light of a street lamp. Her face, wet with tears, was turned downward. There was silence all around, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the sound of cars moving away. Bradley savored the moment. "Now, think hard about who's in charge," he said, crossing his arms over his chest with emphasized mockery. His voice cut through the silence of the night like a knife. "Maybe you'll learn to respect the law." He stared at her, seeing in her silence not the strength but the fear he so loved to inspire. He took a couple of steps forward and leaned closer, adding, almost in a whisper, "You'd think there'd be someone here to help you, wouldn't you? But this is Livingston. You're just another—" He paused, spitting the word out slowly, "a girl who thinks she can do anything." Kayla clenched her teeth to prevent him from the pleasure of hearing her sobs. But at that moment, Bradley stepped toward her car. "What do we have here?" he said, as if talking to himself, opening the car door. He methodically went through her things, pulling out a bag, a backpack, and even a lunch bag. "What's this? Drugs? Weapons? Or maybe you're also a criminal, like your—" He paused, deliberately lingering. "Like your friends." Bradley knew those words were a low blow. knew the township was saturated with racist stereotypes and used them to heighten the humiliation. He pulled a small bag of cookies from her bag, lifted it high above her head, and threw it to the ground, stomping it with his foot. "So much for personal stuff," he threw in with a chuckle, "but I'm sure you're used to worse." It was getting colder outside, but Bradley was in no hurry to leave. He'd done it deliberately, leaving her in plain sight, as if he were displaying her as a trophy of his power. The lingering sound of a siren somewhere in the distance made him glance at his watch. "Okay, beautiful," he said, turning around. "I have better things to do than raise you. Enjoy being alone." He turned on his blinkers and got into his car, but before he drove off, he spoke words over the loudspeaker that made Kayla's heart squeeze. "Next time you get pulled over, think about getting behind the wheel. And if you don't, we'll make sure you never get behind the wheel." Bradley drove away, leaving her alone, trembling, bound, humiliated. The night seemed endless, and the pole to which she was tied seemed to refuse to let her go. In that moment, she realized that this horror would not end on its own. She wasn't Bradley's first victim, but she would be the last, because her father already knew. And when he finds out everything, not a single person in this town will be safe. Livingston, illuminated by the dim lights of old lanterns, was plunged into an unsettling silence. The night, usually serene, became a scene where power collided with vulnerability. Kayla stood bound at the pole, her thin wrists clutched by plastic handcuffs. Every movement hurt, but she was hurt more by Bradley's gaze, the gaze of a man who felt unpunished. "Look how well that turned out," Bradley grinned, leaning against his police car. "You're the centerpiece of this street. Maybe I shouldn't have chosen my profession. I should have been a decorator, huh?" His voice was loud, harsh, shattering the peace of the night. Nearby, silhouettes flickered behind closed curtains. The people of the town saw what was happening, but no one dared to come out. This fear was the result of years of dreading police officers like Bradley. He relished his power, its loneliness and powerlessness. "You know what the funny thing is?" he continued, stepping closer. "I could just give you a fine, but where's the lesson in that? Where's the fun in that?" He looked down at her as if he were a thing, not a person. There was that icy glint in his eyes that Kayla had only seen in villain movies before. His words were drenched in contempt. "You think you're equal to me? You think the law is the same for everyone?" Bradley leaned in close to her ear, his voice quieter but no less threatening. "No, little girl. There is no law for people like you. There's only us, and there's you. Remember that." Kayla held back tears, her chest heaving heavily, but she wouldn't let herself give him what he wanted, to see her broken. Her silence infuriated Bradley. He straightened and tapped the metal pole with his baton, the sound echoing down the empty street. "Naughty, huh? Well, I like it that way. Let's show everyone how those who forget their place end up." An old car passed by. It was driven by an elderly man who slowed considerably as he watched the scene. Bradley, not losing his sly coolness, waved at him. "Come on in, man. Everything's under control here. It's just a lesson in good behavior." The man turned away and stepped on the gas, leaving Kayla alone with her tormentor. Bradley laughed, his laughter echoing off the walls of the surrounding houses. Then he pulled out his phone and took a couple pictures. "It's a memento, so you won't say I don't do parenting. Maybe I'll even show it to my guys at work. Let them know how to handle." He paused, choosing a word that cut like a razor. "People like you." Kayla turned away, her face red with humiliation. She knew the pictures would be another tool in his hands, but all she could do now was endure, tolerate, and hope it would end. Suddenly, Bradley leaned even closer, his face serious. "You know what the scariest thing about this situation is?" he whispered. "Nobody cares about you, not a single person. You can scream, you can cry, but no one will come. No one." He took a step back, glancing at his watch. "Well, time to end our show." His smirk reappeared on his face. "I've got better things to do than spend the night educating the likes of you." He pulled out a knife, cut the plastic handcuffs, and threw them at her feet. "Get out of here before I change my mind. And remember, girl, next time I won't be so kind." Kayla fell to her knees, her legs shaking with cold and fear. Bradley got into his car, turned on his blinkers, and drove away without looking back. But he didn't know one thing. At that moment, a phone camera was glowing in the window of a neighboring house, recording his every move. That night was the beginning of the end of his power. The night in Livingston continued to harbor a silent drama. The streets, seemingly empty, were far from lifeless. Behind drawn curtains, in the shadows of trees and in dark alleys, eyes were hidden. The eyes of those who saw but chose not to interfere. Everyone who witnessed the scene at the pillar consciously chose silence. It was not an easy choice, but it was understandable. Mrs. Grace, the elderly woman who lived across the street, was the first to turn off the lights when she heard the squeal of the patrol car's brakes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pulled back a corner of the curtain and saw Bradley pulling Kayla out of the car. As a young woman, Mrs. Grace had been active in local protests, but the years had taught her Livingston's cardinal rule: keep your head down if you want to live a quiet life. "God, it's him again," she whispered to her cat sitting on the windowsill. "That poor girl. But what can I do?" Her fingers trembled as she tried to pick up the phone, but after scrolling through the contact list, she set it down on the table. The police? Useless? Neighbors? They'd be just as scared as she was. The only thing she could do was pray this would be over sooner. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilson, the owner of a local grocery store, saw the scene from the window of his truck. He was standing outside his store, cigarette in hand, and noticed Bradley throwing derogatory comments at Kayla. Wilson was a man who appreciated order, but even he realized this was out of line. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself, but his feet didn't move. He recalled the case of Thomas, another Livingston resident who had once tried to confront Bradley. Thomas lost his job, his car was repeatedly stopped for inspections, and once his house was even searched on a false report. Wilson decided that this was too high a price to pay for justice. At the other end of the street, where the light of the street lamps didn't reach, a teenager named Jaden was quietly filming what was happening on his phone. He stood behind a trash can, his hands shaking, but the camera continued to work. "Shit," he whispered as he watched Bradley cut the handcuffs and drive away. "I hope someone does something about this." Jaden wasn't the kind of man who liked trouble. He knew Bradley wasn't just a cop, but a man with a lot of clout who always got away with it. But something about him wouldn't let him just walk away. He decided he would put the video on the internet as soon as he got home. Livingstone's silence was not indifference. It was a silence of fear. Everyone knew that it was useless to go against Bradley. He was part of a system that protected him and his methods. Even the mayor of the city turned a blind eye to his behavior, justifying everything with fighting crime. But what happened that night began to change that system. Mrs. Grace, locked in her bedroom, decided to dial a number. She called her niece in a neighboring town. "I don't know what to do, but it's just awful," she said in a shaky voice. "Maybe you know someone who can help? It has to stop." Jaden, back home, uploaded the video to his page with the caption, "This is what's happening in Livingston. When will it end?" Within hours, the video began gaining views. Still, while the town slept, Kayla sat at home, hugging her knees. She thought about how this could have ended worse. She didn't know that her father, returning from a business trip, had already seen that very video. His phone was shaking in his hands, but not with fear, but with rage. Livingston didn't yet know that the moment had come when the silence would be shattered. Morning was coming, and the fear began to turn into something else. Officer Bradley's name had long been known to every resident of Livingston. He was known as the man of the law, but behind that title lurked something far more sinister. Bradley was more than just a cop. He was a symbol of the fear that this town was used to living with. His methods, his way of looking at the world, his absolute confidence in his own impunity, all this made him a true monster in uniform. Bradley joined the Livingston Police Department 20 years ago. Young, ambitious, he quickly established himself as a man willing to go above and beyond his colleagues in the fight against crime. However, his approach to fighting was questionable from the start. The first incident occurred a year after his appointment. Bradley arrested 2 teenagers for hooliganism outside a local park. The teens were black, and, as it later turned out, their only fault was sitting on a bench after curfew. But instead of a simple warning, Bradley used force. He handcuffed them and left them in the station all night, without the right to call their parents. The parents tried to file a complaint, but the case was quickly dismissed. The Livingston Police Department sided with Bradley, saying he was acting within the law. This was the first signal that Bradley could do whatever he wanted. Numerous complaints were filed against Bradley during his years of service. His methods included unwarranted arrests, excessive use of force, and derogatory comments. Minorities in particular were often subjected to his scrutiny. His reports regularly referred to suspicious persons, whose only crime was their race. On one occasion, he stopped a Mexican family, claiming that their car matched the description of the vehicle used in a robbery. Despite the fact that the family had all the paperwork to prove their innocence, Bradley ordered them to get on the ground and wait for backup. It was later discovered that the real suspects had been apprehended an hour earlier in another neighborhood. But Bradley got off with only a reprimand. His rudeness was not limited to humiliation by words. Several residents claimed that he used physical force if he thought someone was not respecting the law enough. One of the most high-profile stories occurred when Bradley punched a teenager for refusing to remove his cap while talking to him. The boy broke his nose, but the case was again hushed up. Bradley never hid his contempt for minorities. His conversations with colleagues and witnesses at crime scenes were filled with derogatory comments and stereotypes. "They're all the same. Another monkey who doesn't know his place," were phrases he uttered as if he considered them the norm. At an internal police meeting, he once stated, "If it were up to me, they wouldn't be walking our streets. We work for them and they only create problems." The colleagues listened in silence. Some agreed, others were afraid to speak. Bradley had become out of reach. Anyone who tried to go against him faced threats, harassment, or loss of employment. Bradley's secret lay in his connections. His brother was an important figure in the district attorney's office, and his father had once served as sheriff of a neighboring county. Those connections allowed him to avoid accountability. When complaints were filed against him, they were destroyed or ignored. Moreover, Bradley always knew how to make himself look like a hero. Every time he was called on the carpet, he would cite statistics: the number of arrests, the reduced crime rate, the vigilance on the streets. It looked convincing to the higher-ups. But behind the facade of effective policemen was a rotten system. Bradley didn't just abuse his power, he turned it into an instrument of repression. He instilled fear, controlled people, silenced them. He knew the system had his back, and he used it without hesitation. That night, leaving Kayla humiliated and bound, Bradley was sure he was in for another day of impunity. What he didn't know was that his actions wouldn't remain hidden. The video Jaden shot had already begun to go viral on the internet. People outside of Livingston who weren't afraid of Bradley began asking questions. Most importantly, he didn't know that Kayla's father was a man with even more serious influence than his connections. Bradley spent his life humiliating those who couldn't fight back, but this time he picked the wrong victim. Bradley's dark past, carefully hidden for years, began to come out, and soon Livingston realized that the fear he'd built his power on was no longer working. Kayla sat in her room, hugging her knees, her mind replaying the events of that night over and over again. Memories of the humiliation, the coldness of the metal pole, Bradley's cruel words, all of it became a weight that pressed down on her. But in the midst of that fear and pain, there was something else. A flame inside her that wouldn't go away. She knew that if she gave in, Bradley would win. And not just him. The system he epitomized would continue to break people like her. Kayla wasn't the kind of person who was used to being quiet. Her mother was always talking. You were born a fighter, girl. The world will never be just on its own. You have to make it so. Her mother, Sarah, was an activist who wasn't afraid to protest even in the toughest of times. She taught Kayla that she should never be afraid to speak up. Kayla's father, Mark, was more reserved, but always supported his daughter, especially when she faced injustice. Kayla grew up in a family where strength and resilience were the foundation. At school, she often stood up for those who were being bullied and got in trouble for her courage more than once. "I can't just stand on the sidelines," she told her mother when she was called to the principal's office for standing up for an abused junior high school student. "And you're right," Sarah smiled. "There are always more people who stand on the sidelines, and it's people like you who change the world." As Bradley tied her to the pole, Kayla felt a fear like she'd never felt before. It wasn't just fear for herself. It was fear that she might break, that this man, this system would defeat her. But with every minute spent in humiliation, her resolve grew stronger. She looked at the passing cars, at the silhouettes behind the curtains, and a realization grew in her heart. She must fight for more than just herself. She must show these people that fear could not be their only choice. When Kayla's father, Mark, came home and found out what had happened, his face turned pale. He sat silently at the table, his hands balled into fists as he tried to control his rage. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, trying to speak calmly. "I'm fine, Daddy," she answered, though her voice shook. "But this isn't right. We have to do something." Mark looked at her. He saw that his daughter had inherited her mother's character. Sarah, who had died 3 years ago in a car accident, had always believed in the power of truth. Now he saw that faith in Kayla's eyes. "You're right," he said quietly. "We will." The next morning, Kayla decided she wasn't going to hide. Her classmates had already started discussing the video that Jaden had made, and some of them had even texted her to express their support. But she knew that wasn't enough. She had to tell her story. At school, she walked over to the bulletin board where everyone was leaving their messages and pinned a large note. "I was humiliated by a man who is supposed to uphold the law. I don't keep quiet. I'm fighting back. If you too believe Bradley should be held accountable for his actions, join me." She attached a photo taken from the video of Bradley standing next to her tied to a pole. This act was the start of her campaign. Classmates started sharing the post on social media. Soon, it reached the local press. Journalists contacted Kayla, and she agreed to be interviewed. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said to the camera. "We should not be afraid of those who are supposed to protect us." Kayla realized that this wasn't going to be easy for her. She had seen how scared the people in Livingston were, but she couldn't let fear rule her life. She decided to fight not only for herself, but for those who couldn't. Her father, who had always tried to keep a low profile, was now her main ally. He began gathering documents, finding lawyers, and contacting human rights organizations. Together, they became a force Bradley never expected to meet. Kayla knew there would be many challenges ahead, but she also knew she was not alone. She was the voice of those who had been silent for a long time, and that voice was growing louder and louder. A silver SUV cut through the silence of the night on the dark highway to Livingston. Behind the wheel was Mark Wilson, a man with a hard stare, thick dark hair with gray streaking through it, and a manner that spoke of discipline. He was 47 years old and carried both past victories and heavy defeats under his belt. Mark had just returned from a business trip. He was a crisis management expert who consulted for major corporations and government agencies across the country. His job involved dealing with difficult situations, and he was used to acting coolly, but what he saw that night threw him off balance. Mark learned of the incident by accident. When he stopped at a gas station just outside of town to buy coffee, his attention was caught by the animated conversation of the employees in the parking lot. "Have you seen this video?" said one of them, showing something on his phone screen. "Bradley's acting weird again. This time it's a black girl tied to a pole. It's a disgrace." Mark froze, trying to remain calm. He stepped closer and asked to see the video. The young man looked surprised for a second, but when he saw the stern expression on Mark's face, he handed over his phone. The screen played footage of his daughter standing tied to a pole, while Bradley grinned and said something. Mark felt his hands clench into fists. Fury boiled up inside him, but years of self-improvement had taught him to keep his emotions under control. He handed the phone back and got into the car without a word. Mark was no ordinary man. His name was well known in certain circles. He was an Army veteran who had participated in several combat operations. After his service, he had a career in corporate security, where his reputation as a man who could handle any crisis grew every year. But behind his professional toughness was a man who loved his family deeply. The loss of his wife 3 years ago was a hard blow to him, but he promised himself that he would do everything he could to ensure that their daughter grew up strong and successful. Kayla was his pride. Her independence, courage, and sharp mind all reminded him of Sarah. Mark knew Kayla wouldn't give up without a fight, but he also knew she would need support. When Mark entered the house, Kayla was sitting at the kitchen table. Her face was weary, but the fire of determination burned in her eyes. She looked up when she saw her father, and for a moment her expression softened. "Do you already know?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but without a shadow of fear. "Yes," he answered briefly, sitting down across from her. "I saw the video." Kayla nodded and, without averting her gaze, added, "We can't keep quiet. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. I'm not going to let him win." Mark looked at her and felt proud. His daughter was strong, just like her mother, but he also knew that fighting Bradley would be dangerous. Not only was this man abusing his power, but he was deeply entrenched in the system. "We won't be silent," he said at last, his voice firm. "But you have to understand, it won't be easy. He has connections, power, and he knows how to defend himself." "I'm ready," Kayla replied. Her voice sounded confident, but Mark could see the tiredness in her eyes. Mark sprang into action that very night. He contacted his legal colleagues to find the best lawyer. He then began calling his media contacts, realizing that public attention would be a key factor in the fight. "They want us to be afraid," he told his daughter, filling out paperwork for a formal complaint. "But fear is their weapon, not ours. We will use the truth." Mark realized that this was not only a personal fight for his daughter, but a larger battle for justice in Livingston. He knew there were those in town who were afraid to speak out against Bradley, but he also realized that the truth could bring people together. The next day, reporters started showing up in town. Jaden's video had already gone viral, and the media's attention was now focused on Livingston. Mark arranged a meeting with a lawyer and representatives of human rights organizations. He wasn't going to give Bradley a chance for cover. Kayla, despite her fatigue, actively participated in all the meetings. Her words in the interview touched many people. "This isn't just about me. It's about anyone who's afraid to raise their voice. If we don't stop him now, he'll do it again." Mark looked at her and watched her power grow. He knew that together they could change not only the fate of their family, but the entire city. But Mark also realized that Bradley would not give up without a fight. He had received the first warnings: anonymous threatening phone calls, strange cars parked outside his house. It was the beginning of a war he accepted with cold determination. "We're ready," he said to Kayla as they checked their IDs together. "But you have to be strong. They will try to intimidate us." "They've already tried," Kayla said, clenching her hands into fists. "But I'm not afraid. This battle was just beginning." But Mark knew one thing: he would never leave his daughter alone. Bradley thought he was dealing with another victim. He was wrong. This time he was facing a man who wasn't afraid of power or threats. By dawn, Livingston was never the same. Jaden's video of Kayla's humiliation was spreading rapidly through social media, causing a wave of outrage far beyond the town's borders. At the center of this storm was Mark Wilson, a man who, despite his cold and reserved nature, was ready to launch a real battle for justice. Mark's first step was to study the situation. He knew that one video was not enough against Bradley. To win, he needed evidence that would show not only a specific case, but a systematic abuse of power. Mark began by reviewing Bradley's file. Using his contacts, he contacted one of his former co-workers, James Connor, who worked as an analyst for the Department of Homeland Security. "I need everything I can find on this man," Mark said, handing James Bradley's name and service records. "Complaints, reports, even rumors. I need a full profile." "It's going to take time," James replied, "but I'll do my best." While James gathered materials, Mark worked locally. He spoke to Livingston residents who had encountered Bradley, persuading them to share their stories. Many were afraid, but when they learned that Mark was willing to follow through, Some agreed to speak anonymously about their encounters with the officer. On the second day, Mark met with Lauren Hayes, an attorney known for her cases against police brutality. Lauren was an experienced and determined woman who knew how to fight systemic injustice. "This isn't just a case against one cop," Lauren said, scrutinizing the materials Mark had gathered. "It's a war against the whole system that covers him." "Then we must be ready for war," Mark replied, his voice firm. Lauren began preparing a formal complaint. She planned not only to file a police report, but also to organize a lawsuit against the Livingston Police Department for negligence in covering up Bradley's actions. "We have to get as much attention as possible," she said. "This is our best chance for success." Alongside his legal work, Mark started to engage the press. He knew that publicity was a powerful weapon against those who were used to operating in the shadows. He organized a press conference downtown. The event was attended not only by journalists, but also by Livingston residents, many of whom felt that this struggle touched them personally. Kayla, standing next to her father, gave a speech that touched everyone to the core. "I could keep quiet. I could have let fear win. But then nothing would have changed. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. We deserve to live in a city where the law protects us, not humiliates us." These words became the catalyst. Local people began to tell their stories, and journalists from around the country began to publish stories about the Livingston scandal. Meanwhile, Bradley, having learned about the emerging scandal, did not stay away. He realized that his reputation and career were in jeopardy and decided to strike back. Through his allies in the police department, he began spreading rumors about Mark and his family. "Wilson just wants the glory," he said on the sidelines. "His daughter broke the law, and now they're trying to make me look like the villain." In addition, Bradley tried to suppress the fire early on by sending his men to Mark with a warning. "If you stop now, this could all end peacefully." But Mark only grinned upon hearing those words. "Tell your boss I won't stop until he's accountable for everything he's done," he replied. "It's not his town. This is our town." Soon, activists from neighboring towns began arriving in Livingston. National human rights organizations offered to help, and local groups began organizing rallies. Livingstone, which had always lived in the shadow of fear, began to awaken. Mark, seeing the support, felt that they were heading in the right direction, but he also realized that there were still many challenges ahead. Mark assembled a team of allies who became his backbone. These included lawyers, activists, journalists, and even former police officers who had once worked with Bradley but left because of his methods. "We will make sure this man never wears a uniform again," Lauren said at one of the meetings. "But to do so, we must be prepared for a long and difficult struggle." In the third week after the campaign began, James, a friend of Mark's, returned with shocking documents. They contained the details of dozens of complaints against Bradley that had been hushed up by the police department. These documents became a powerful weapon in the hands of Mark and his team. "This is our chance," Mark said, looking through the paperwork. "We'll show that Bradley isn't just a bad officer. He's a symptom of the system that's covering for him." Mark Wilson knew this was only the beginning. Fighting Bradley and the system that allowed him to act with impunity was difficult and dangerous. But he also knew that this time Livingston would no longer be silent. People were beginning to realize that their voice mattered. Though the war was not yet won, Mark felt he had taken the first step toward justice, a step that could no longer be stopped. A storm was raging in Livingston, and at its center stood Mark Wilson, a man who refused to accept injustice. To a town accustomed to silent fear, Mark's actions were like thunder. He didn't just raise his voice against Bradley. He became the leader of a movement that threatened to disrupt the system that had harbored the officer for years. Mark realized that the battle for justice would be a long one. His goal was clear: expose Bradley, punish those responsible, and change the rules of the game. But to do that, he had to act quickly and decisively. One evening, as Mark was returning home from a meeting with his lawyers, he was blocked by a patrol car. Behind the wheel was none other than Bradley. He got out slowly, arms folded across his chest, and grinned at Mark. "So, Wilson, you think you can take on the law?" His voice was laced with mockery. "You're not the first to try. And you know what happened to the others?" Mark remained calm, though rage boiled inside him. "I'm not trying to fight the law, Bradley," he said in a steady voice. "I'm trying to restore it." For a moment, Bradley's expression changed. His smile disappeared, giving way to irritation. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, leaning closer. "You don't realize who you're messing with." Mark took a step forward without averting his gaze. "You don't understand, Bradley," he said quietly but firmly. "I won't stop. Not today, not tomorrow, not a year from now. You're going to answer for everything." Bradley froze. He was used to seeing fear in people's eyes, but this time his opponent was different. This man was ready to go all the way. The next day, Mark increased the pressure. He realized that it was impossible to defeat the system alone, so he started looking for allies. The first step was to contact major human rights organizations. His team sent the evidence they had collected to organizations such as the ACLU and Amnesty International. "This is not just a case of police violence," Mark said at a meeting with the organization. "This is a systematic problem. We need to draw as much attention to it as possible." These organizations began providing legal and media support. Soon, Livingston's story was in the national news. Leading TV stations discussed Bradley's actions, and the hashtag number Justice for Kayla became a trend on social media. At the same time, Mark focused on undermining the credibility of the Livingston Police Department. Documents provided by James Connor became a key weapon. They contained details of hushed complaints about Bradley, covered-up incidents, and falsified reports. Mark organized a press conference to present these documents. The Livingston Police Department didn't just cover up Bradley's actions, he told reporters. It actively obstructed justice. "This is not just a mistake, it's a felony." His words resonated. The next day, the state prosecutor's office announced the opening of an investigation into the department. Realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, Bradley and his allies became more aggressive. Threatening calls became more frequent, and one day Mark discovered that his car's brake hoses had been cut. This was a clear signal. But instead of being scared, Mark stepped up his actions. He hired security guards to protect Kayla and himself, and installed cameras around the house. "Let them try," he said to his daughter. "I'm ready for whatever they do." The tension culminated in a rally organized by Mark and his allies. Hundreds of people gathered in Livingston's main square. Among them were both local residents and activists from neighboring towns. Kayla again gave a speech that came to symbolize the struggle. "I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because I want justice. We all deserve to live in a city where we are protected, not humiliated." Her words were met with a standing ovation, but the rally was more than a show of unity. It was a warning to those who had tried to shelter Bradley. Their time was running out. Soon, Mark's efforts began to bear fruit. Bradley was suspended while the investigation was underway. The police department came under pressure, and some of its officers began to speak out. New details about Bradley's illegal actions surfaced, which only strengthened the case against him. Mark knew this was only the beginning. Bradley and his allies would fight to the last man, but he also knew that he had something they didn't: the truth and the support of the people. Mark Wilson became for Livingston a symbol of resistance. His anger was directed not only at Bradley, but at the system that had allowed him to abuse his power for years. It was a war, but a war for justice, and Mark was willing to go all the way to the end to win. Bradley thought he was invincible, but this time he faced an opponent who could not be intimidated. Soon after the investigation began, a network that had remained hidden from view for years began to unravel in Livingston. Behind the facade of a small police department, a whole system of corruption and abuse was concealed by superiors and officials. Mark Wilson and his team kept digging deeper, and each new layer of this system caused more and more outrage. This wasn't just a fight against one man. It was exposing the system that was turning Livingston into a city of fear. The materials received from James Connor were a real bombshell. Among the documents were the following. 1. List of jammed complaints. More than 20 formal complaints against Bradley over the past 10 years that included allegations of abuse of authority, use of force, and racial discrimination. These complaints were not only ignored, but removed from the records. 2. Falsified reports. Several incidents in which Bradley arrested innocent people to improve crime-fighting statistics. The reports deliberately included false charges, which were then forgotten when the case went to trial. 3. Black Budget Cashier's Office, an informal fund through which money for special favors passed. These funds were used to bribe witnesses, conceal evidence, and other illegal activities. 4. Photos and video. In one of the files, James found photos and surveillance footage proving that Bradley had repeatedly engaged in the use of force against civilians, especially minorities. This evidence became the basis for a series of press articles and formal requests to the state attorney's office. People began to recall stories that had been hushed up for years. One such story involved the Rodriguez family, who 3 years ago lost their son after the Bradley interrogation. The official story was that the teen allegedly resisted arrest, but now evidence has emerged that his death was the result of excessive use of force. "They took our son away from us," the boy's mother said at a press conference. "They didn't even give us the right to know the truth. And now I want them to answer for it." Rodriguez's story has come to symbolize how far abuse has come. People who had previously been afraid to speak out began to tell their stories. Each new testimony became part of a puzzle that soon revealed the true face of governance. The investigation revealed that Bradley did not act alone. He was covered for by high-ranking people in the police department, the prosecutor's office, and even the mayor's office. The police department turned out to be a corrupt network where everyone protected everyone else to keep the system intact. "We all knew Bradley was a problem," said the anonymous source, a former police officer, "but superiors preferred to turn a blind eye. He was convenient for them. His brutality was used to intimidate people." The evidence also pointed to the city's mayor, who received large donations from the Police Officers Association. This money was found to be used to pay lawyers to defend officers accused of misconduct. When information about corruption began to surface, protests erupted in Livingston. People who had been silent for years began to take to the streets. There was shouting at the rallies. "Stop covering up for criminals. Bradley should go to jail. The whole system is rotten." In the backdrop of these events, the police were in crisis. Some officers began to resign, fearing repercussions. Others tried to defend themselves by claiming they were acting within the law. But public opinion was inexorable. Confidence in the Livingston Police Department was shattered. Meanwhile, Bradley, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly precarious, tried to justify himself. In an interview, he said, "All these accusations are lies. It's just an attempt to discredit me for doing my job. I'm protecting our city." His words caused a flurry of outrage. Many saw his excuses as another attempt to evade responsibility. "He's only protecting himself," Kayla said in response to this interview. "And he does it at the expense of the people he's supposed to be protecting." The investigation culminated in the discovery of documents indicating that Livingston's police chief personally ordered the destruction of evidence against Bradley. These documents provided evidence that the corruption was systemic. "It's not just Bradley," said attorney Lauren Hayes. "It's the entire system that allows people like him to act with impunity, and that system must be broken." By the end of the chapter, the situation in Livingston had reached a breaking point. The facts revealed shook not only the city, but the entire state. The prosecutor's office began preparing a criminal case against Bradley and his accomplices. The community demanded change. Mark Wilson looked on with a sense of pride and anger. His efforts were beginning to bear fruit, but he knew the battle was not over. Behind each new revelation was an even greater challenge. But one thing was certain: the truth could no longer be hidden. Now, Mark and Kayla stood on the threshold of the final stage of the fight for justice, and they were ready to go all the way. The square in front of the Livingston courthouse was filled with people. The crowd held signs that read, "Justice for Kayla," "Zrenia, no room for corruption," "Zrenia," and "Bradley должен быть привлечен к ответственности." It was the day everyone had been waiting for. The court hearing where the case against Bradley was heard was the culmination of Mark and Kayla's struggle. As Bradley entered the courtroom, accompanied by lawyers and guards, his eyes met Mark's. They stood on opposite sides of the room, but the tension between them was palpable. "Do you think you won?" Bradley whispered as he walked past. "I think you're finally going to answer for your actions," Mark answered, his voice firm but quiet. The prosecutor presented evidence: video of the incident with Kayla, documents exposing corruption, and witness testimony. Every fact, every document strengthened the case against Bradley. But the defense tried its best. Bradley's attorneys tried to portray the case as a witch hunt, saying he was just doing his job. But their words sounded weaker and weaker in the face of the evidence. When the judge went into deliberation to deliver his verdict, the silence in the courtroom was tense. People held their breath. But before the judge returned, there was an unexpected turn. One of the former police officers who had previously worked with Bradley rose from his seat and stated that he wanted to give additional testimony. He admitted that he had personally witnessed Bradley tampering with evidence and using violence against detainees. "I can't keep quiet anymore," he said. "The truth has to come out." An hour later, the judge returned and announced the decision. Bradley was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to a long prison term, and the police corruption case was referred for further investigation. The crowd outside exploded with joyful shouts. Mark and Kayla stood side by side, watching this moment. They knew this wasn't just their victory. It was a victory for the whole town. A few months later, Livingston began to change. Police reforms were made, and residents felt their voices were finally being heard. Mark returned to his job, but now he was not only a crisis expert, but also a symbol of strength and justice for his city. Kayla, inspired by what had happened, decided to go to university to study law. Her goal was clear: to fight for those who cannot defend themselves. Livingston was still a small town, but now it was a town where justice had won. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your stories in the comments. We really value your opinions and experiences. Each of your comments is incredibly important to us because together we can not only discuss these situations, but also find ways to make the world a better place. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It helps us keep telling important and needed stories. We wish you a wonderful day. Remember, your support means more to us than you can imagine.